We are ready to start, and I'm gonna jump right in, and so obviously there was a big development in American politics on Thursday night, the debate between President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump, and the obvious um, uh, lack of a convincing performance from the current president has all of us wondering what can and should be done, and that is a large part of what we will talk about today. I also have on the board the Supreme Court, and we will discuss recent decisions as this session comes to a conclusion at length in a future lecture. But there was a couple of decisions this week that overturned a long-standing doctrine, the Chevron doctrine that had been enforced for 40 years. And that was a doctrine that was essential to the functioning of the administrative state, which is really the place where an awful lot of the action is in American politics in the second half of the 20th century to the present, right? And so the decision that was handed down yesterday, which in many ways is taking a back seat to the focus on the debate, may actually be the most consequential thing that happened in the last week. And I do want to speak a little bit about that decision as well. But my title suggests what we saw on Thursday night in the debate was a performance that really calls into question whether or not American politics is functioning, whether or not American democracy is working anymore. Right. On the one hand, we had a candidate, Donald Trump, who lied with total and reckless abandon, who was completely undisciplined by fact, by truth, by accountability, and who in veiled and unveiled ways threatened, if reelected, to be more destructive, more vindictive, and more lawless in his second term in office than he was in his first term in office. And on the other hand, his opponent, the current president of the United States, Joe Biden, appeared to be so diminished, so incapacitated, that he was really incapable of holding Donald Trump to account, of countering or even exposing the lies, of indicating just how dangerous what he was saying and proposing was. And so in the split screen here, I have the image of the image that so many of us saw on the right of the screen of Joe Biden looking, and I think it's a look of disdain. It's a look of almost disbelief. Am I really hearing this from the candidate for one of America's two main political parties? How can this man be on this stage? And yet the look also communicates weakness and age, right? The slack jaw, the unevenness of the eyes, the total demeanor. And I will talk more about this in just a moment. But the idea that debates are really there for less engaged voters to tune in for half an hour or an hour into American politics to make up their minds. And very often the way in which those voters make up their minds has much more to do with appearance and optics than it has to do with substance. And Donald Trump basically appeared, and I think it's a really just a matter of optics, to be capable of being president of the United States, and Joe Biden didn't. And I'm going to counsel today that as we think about the aftermath of Thursday night's disaster, that we need to rigorously avoid engaging in magical thinking. The stakes are too high. And so let me repeat one of the phrases that Max Weber, the great German sociologist, coined. And he said, "A man who has a vocation for politics is able to let reality work on him." And so there is no way, I think, to excuse or explain what happened Thursday night. Joe Biden had a cold. Joe Biden was perhaps over prepared. Joe Biden was perhaps sleep deprived because he's president of the United States and he's engaged in managing many crises that are playing out in real time throughout the world. And he was prepared to talk about policy detail in a way that he's never been very good at doing. And so, in a sense, poorly prepared for this debate. Say whatever you will to try to excuse or explain the performance of Thursday night. It is going to remain a stubborn and salient impression in the minds of many voters for the remainder of this campaign. I think it's unlikely that Joe Biden, no matter how vigorous he appears on the campaign trail, no matter how well he does in the next debate, will be able to erase the impression he left Thursday night. And so we need to reckon with what this reveals. And I think among the other things it reveals is that we have two men who have been nominated by their parties, the two main parties in American politics, neither one of whom is really particularly well qualified to be the president of the United States. And at the same time, we have a very well functioning, if very conservative Supreme Court. The hyper majority, the conservative supermajority of whom are increasingly taking advantage of how dysfunctional our electoral politics are to roll back the operation of the American state. And that this week brings home, right, just how damaged our politics are. So I do want to speak with you today both about how we got here and what we can do about it, more focused on the election of 2024, because frankly, if Donald Trump is elected president again, and it certainly appears that is the direction we're headed in, then things will continue to get worse, not better. So let me focus first on what happened Thursday night. And I'm going to start with the negative tasks that each of these two candidates had. Donald Trump's task, excuse the language, was to appear non-felonious, right? He has just been convicted of a felony. He needs to appear like somebody who is not a criminal, doesn't belong behind bars, but in fact might be an effective president of the United States. And just through his demeanor, I want to suggest he accomplished that, and that perhaps the ground rules of the debate assisted him. The fact that his microphone was muted when Joe Biden was speaking removed the temptation for Donald Trump to interrupt and bluster and bully in the way that he has in past debates. And the result is that he actually appeared a bit more calm, a bit more collected, a bit more, I hate to use the word, but statesman-like. And so Donald Trump passed the negative test, right? Joe Biden, right? The fundamental heuristic that has stuck to Joe Biden throughout this campaign, as we can see, right? Nearly three-quarters of the American electorate think that Joe Biden is too old to be an effective president. Only around 10% of Americans disagree with that statement. Joe Biden had to convince the American people that even though he's 81, soon to be 82, he still is sharp, still is vigorous, still has the energy, the capacity, the focus, the will to effectively manage the single most powerful office in the United States, perhaps the single most awesome responsibility in the world, being president of the United States. And he failed that test abysmally. Right. And again, I don't think we need to dismiss the explanations, but we do need to take seriously that many voters are not concerned with the explanation. They tuned in to see, is this 81-year-old as incapacitated and diminished as we worry that he is? And the salient impression was that he was. The positive task that each of these men had, right? And for Donald Trump, it was pretty straightforward: convince the American people that they were better off under his presidency than they have been under Biden's presidency, and that the reason that they were better off is because Trump was a better president than Joe Biden and put in place better policies, had more effective leadership. And I believe that for a low information voter, for somebody who is just basically listening and taking at face value what these two candidates say, Donald Trump effectively did that. He effectively suggested that Joe Biden's immigration policy, that Joe Biden's weak leadership style, that Joe Biden's incapacity to put his stamp on world affairs was responsible for inflation, for economic insecurity, for growing anarchy and conflict in many regions in the world, and that Donald Trump had done better when he was president. Now, in order to convince those voters of that case, he lied without shame or remorse. He said things were true of him that were true of Joe Biden. He said things that were absolutely false about Joe Biden, etc. But having said that, Joe Biden lacked the capacity to effectively rebut or correct the disinformation that Donald Trump was spouting, right? And so for many naive viewers, the task that Trump had to perform, convince them that he was a better president. These are two men, both of whom have been president for 4 years. He seemed to have passed. Joe Biden's task was more difficult. And I'll get into this in a moment, but most Americans are, in many respects, worse off today than they were 4 years ago, right? Primarily economically, this is due to inflation. And to be as clear as possible, this is due not just to the fact that inflation has eroded purchasing power for the bottom 50% of Americans, rendered them more economically vulnerable, but also due to the fact that long-standing trends of the last 40 to 50 years, had already rendered so many Americans vulnerable and precarious that they did not have the cushion, that they did not have the capacity to absorb what wasn't extreme, but nevertheless was painful inflation over the last few years. They were already living paycheck to paycheck. There was no fat to cut in their budgets. And so the increase in the cost of groceries, gas, and rent means that they are now making hard sacrifices. Joe Biden had to say, I understand that. I feel your pain. I've done everything in my power to address the problem of inflation, inequality, and the post-COVID economy. And by the way, we are much better off for what I have done than we would have been had I not done it. And I will continue to do more of the same. And what Donald Trump did in his 4 years, cutting taxes on the wealthy, mismanaging COVID, among other things, initiating a trade war with China made my task more difficult. And if Donald Trump is reelected, he will do more of the same and make your situation worse. That's a more complex message than you are worse off today than you were 4 years ago. After 4 years of me, you were better off, right? And so Biden had to be a particularly effective communicator in order to get across his central message. And the secondary message that Biden had to get across is that Donald Trump is dangerous, and that among other things, he is responsible for the fact that almost half of American women now don't have the right to abortion that they had when he started his presidency. And by the way, if he's president again, he will continue to appoint conservatives to the Supreme Court, and things will get worse, not better, for American women. And Biden completely botched his answer to the abortion question, what should have been the easiest, the most give me question in this debate. For some odd reason, he pivoted in the middle of it to the one thing he shouldn't have been talking about, immigration, right? The issue that is most advantageous to Trump, least advantageous to Biden. And so I think it's hard to exaggerate how poor a performance Joe Biden had on Thursday night. Now let's contextualize this in the electoral prospects of these two men in order to understand how damaging this was and how grave the danger is. And so I have on the board two different models. I'm going to be wonky with you for a moment. You have heard me talk in the past about Nate Silver, right? Who wrote for the New York Times and then founded 538 and worked with ABC News and broke away a year and a half ago and now has his own Substack, right? His own web service that he provides. So this is the 538 election prediction as of a day or two ago. I didn't update it today. It actually says Joe Biden has 51% chance of winning, Donald Trump 49, right? So they took away the tie when they reran their model. And to be as clear as possible, we talked about this, I think, a week ago. What this model shows is, and the way the model works, it doesn't just look at the national polls, it looks at state by state polls to try to predict electoral college results, because of course that's how the presidency is actually decided. And it looks at so-called fundamentals, how the economy is doing, where consumer sentiment is, where general opinion about the well-being of the country and personal well-being is, and it predicts that there's roughly a coin toss chance that Joe Biden will win. But the scenario in which Joe Biden wins is a scenario in which he wins an incredibly narrow electoral college vote. He wins by maybe 2 votes in the electoral college. And I'll just say, given how contested our recent elections are, even the coin toss chance that the 538 model gives Joe Biden is not something that we should find reassuring. I think that that is a very dangerous scenario. This is a very fragile lead. And by the way, of course, this doesn't yet take into account how poorly Joe Biden did in the debate Thursday night. Now, this is Nate Silver's model. And Nate Silver does some stuff that's very similar to the old model he built, but he does some stuff that's different in terms of how he weights economic factors, and he drills down a little bit more on Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, the probably most important states for Joe Biden to win if he's going to have a shot at winning this election. And what Nate Silver finds is quite different, right? That there's almost a two-thirds chance that Donald Trump is going to win, not the popular vote, right? That on his analysis, Joe Biden barely wins the popular vote, but Donald Trump wins a relatively close but still comfortable electoral college vote. And so I just want to say at the outset, right, that I believe, and I've shared with you my reasons for believing in the past. I'll say a little bit more today, that Donald Trump is a genuine and potentially quite destructive danger to American democracy. He is the kind of leader who, in the past, has had success in dismantling democratic institutions from within. He is riding a international populist wave. It's not just the United States, but countries all over the world face similar threats, and he now has both an entire political party and an entire quadrant of the American media system doing his work, completely loyal to him. And so the idea that there's a coin toss chance that this man will be president, or a pretty good likelihood that this man will be president, neither one of those things I think should we find in any way acceptable. And so the idea that the last vestiges of normality in American politics ended this week have to do with the fact that we should expect, in light of Biden's performance, that the likelihood of Donald Trump being the next president of the United States increased dramatically on Thursday. It is probably the beginning of the end of the Biden presidency, either because it's likely that Biden will lose his reelection campaign as a result of what happened Thursday, or alternatively, because it will lead Joe Biden to resign, to drop out of the 2024 presidential race, and hopefully make way for somebody who has a better chance of beating Donald Trump. And so we'll get to talking about that in a moment. I want to be as clear as possible. Donald Trump could do something equally disastrous to what Joe Biden did Thursday night. And then all bets are off, right? And please note that what Donald Trump did Thursday night in the context of a normal democracy would have been totally catastrophic for him, right? He would have been exposed as a complete fabulous, somebody totally disconnected from reality had he had an effective opponent. And so it's still not the case. I want to say it's premature to be writing Joe Biden's political obituary. But having said that, we have to let reality work on us. And what happened Thursday night makes it considerably more likely that Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States. So, having said all that, let me just point out very quickly who we're thinking about when we think about whether or not Thursday makes a big difference. And we're obviously not thinking about the convinced MAGA voters. They already knew who they were going to vote for, nor are we thinking about the people who believe that Donald Trump is a genuine threat to American democracy and Joe Biden has been a pretty good president. I count myself in those numbers, but having said that, we were not going to have our minds shifted by the outcome of the debate. What we're talking about is what we've been calling low information or less engaged voters, people who rarely tune in to the details of political news, where the news finds them as opposed to them finding the news, typically on social media. They've been seeing memes and images of Joe Biden looking diminished, wearing diapers, falling behind the podium, wandering off into the wilderness and having to be pulled back by Joe. Much of this doctored and fabricated, but nevertheless, they're not following the details of the news, so they don't know that. They tuned in Thursday night and they were asking themselves a simple question. Is Joe Biden simply too old to be an effective president? Is it the case that because Trump is a convicted felon, he is no longer qualified to be president of the United States? And the voters considering voting for Trump for the first time came away, I think, in many ways reassured. Younger voters, people of color, I don't think got any reason to believe that Joe Biden would be effectively on their side and capable of doing anything to make their situation better. Similarly, for disengaged Democrats, there was no reason given on Thursday night to go to the ballot poll. As we've seen, right, Joe Biden has especially seen his support plummet with these groups of voters. He asked for the earlier debate date and mainly structured the format of the debate because he wanted to revive his candidacy. He wanted to prove himself in the test mano a mano with Donald Trump, and he failed his own test. I don't mean to be cruel, but I think this picture is worth 1,000 words, right? And obviously, we've got presidential in the background, but this is not a man who looks presidential. And anybody can snap an unflattering picture of anyone, right? It's, the camera angle, the moment at which it's taken. But please note, and his smug look, his puzzled look, the way in which he was mugging for the camera, Donald Trump knows better than Joe Biden how to manage live TV. The format of this debate was very much like the format of the very first televised debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. And in many respects, I think this debate was a bit like that. If you were to just read the text with a lot of knowledge in the background, you would say Joe Biden, despite the flatness of his delivery, the occasional confusion, the meandering structure of his answers, nevertheless did a more convincing job. But if you just are watching the debate, Donald Trump clearly appears to be the stronger, the more vigorous, the more capable man. And that is the impression that a lot of those voters came away with. Please note, in terms of the background, that Joe Biden had an uphill battle, right? And that's in part because so many people think he's too old, but in part because he's just not a very popular president. It's a difficult time to be an incumbent anywhere in the democratic world because most people think democracy is not working well, but it's a particularly difficult time to be the president of the United States. And we see this in the economic data that wage growth exceeded inflation for basically the entirety of Donald Trump's presidency, and inflation exceeded wage growth, often quite substantially, for the majority of Joe Biden's presidency. And so Americans across the board think that Donald Trump did a better job in the economy than Joe Biden. Similarly, and getting at the electoral mood, right? Um, the majority of Americans, and this is a super majority, 70% basically think our political and economic institutions don't work anymore. So they either need to be torn down or subject to major change. And by the way, this is not some strange delusion. They think this because these institutions have failed to protect their economic viability, to solve our problems, to pull us back from this extreme polarization. Because when they look at Washington, what they see is dysfunction in Congress and weakness in the presidency because the United States is increasingly incapable of influencing events throughout the world to suit our interests in the ways that we were for maybe the 30 odd years after the end of the Cold War. Our institutions are not working and do need to be reformed. Who is more likely to do that? The vast majority of Americans, again, think Donald Trump is much more likely than Joe Biden to do it. So again, Joe Biden had an uphill battle last night. He had to convince them on the one hand that the changes that Donald Trump would bring about would not solve our problems and would in fact be destructive for us. That would not, should not have been such a hard task. But Biden fumbled that ball. And on the other hand, he had to convince them that he was, in fact, doing things to make these institutions work better for us and that he deserved a second 4 years to continue that work. That is a much harder task. And I think that's one that he completely failed at. So I will now pivot to thinking about the likely outcome of Thursday night if nothing changes dramatically over the next 4 months in between now and November and the presidential election. And that is that Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States. And I do believe that the growing sign of panic that we see in the Democratic Party, in the media elite, in the Democratic donor class, reflects the fact that there is good reason to believe that Donald Trump would be a more dangerous president in a second term. That's in part because he lost the last election and since then has been convicted of multiple felonies and indicted nearly 100 times. His sense that people came after him, maybe that they stole the election from him, and that he wants to get vengeance against a system he never liked and that now has come after him, is going to be intense in a second presidency. It is also the case that I think that anything that might have restrained him from following his worst impulses has been diminished or completely vanished as a result of the fact that although he's been convicted of 34 felonies, he seems to have, in fact, been strengthened by the conviction, not only in terms of donors, where he's had record fundraising, but in general within his party. And so this has led him to do something he was already doing, embracing an image as an outlaw, as a transgressor, as a disruptor. And there just doesn't seem to be very much that can be done to punish this man that would lead him to worry about the consequences of breaking rules or laws if he were president again. So the lesson that Trump has learned is that he can get away with it. And please note that in a second term, he would have a much more specific idea of what he wanted to get accomplished and would have the entire political party and think tanks and lawyers and donors all working behind him to do this. And I think many of the institutions that we hope might check him would be ineffective, right? And I know I'm reviewing material right now, but I'm doing it in a new context, in the context of the aftermath of Joe Biden's abysmal performance in that debate. I think we have to be all the more worried. We really need to focus on what will happen if Donald Trump is reelected, because it just got much more likely that that's going to occur. And we know, right, in essence, he has not really put out a party platform, but he has outlined, working with Steve Miller and with the Heritage Foundation, Project 2025, to increase dramatically presidential powers, to strip away the checks and balances that constrain executive authority, to weaponize the Justice Department, to use it to go after his political adversaries, his enemies, and independent journalism, that he will also try to use the powers of the executive branch on the one hand to overcome the limitations, legal limitations on immigrations and custom enforcement and the Border Patrol in going after immigrants, and also potentially use the military on American soil. All of this is deeply dangerous to American democracy. So I want to conclude this portion of the lecture by asking two sets of questions. And the first is a kind of how did we get here, right? How did we get to the point where we have such a bad choice as we saw on stage on Thursday night? How did we get to the point where it seems increasingly likely that a man who's a threat to our democracy is going to be elected to be the next president of the United States? And then the second and perhaps most urgent question, although one that we have to be very careful in not simply engaging in magical thinking and answering, what, if anything, can we do in the next few months about this? So, first, the background context. And I want to suggest that we're seeing the limits of negative partisanship. And so negative partisanship, right, we've talked about this before, is the idea that the main thing that motivates you to vote is fear or disdain for the other side, right? That if they get elected, the country's going to hell in a handbasket. Because they've been elected, the country's gone to hell. And so we have to vote for our side no matter who they throw up, right? And having said that, I think in part this is leading some mainstream Republicans to hold their nose and support Donald Trump. I think it's a Faustian bargain they may regret in the end. But having said that, I think much more important is the fact that the Democrats refused really to contest Joe Biden in the primaries on the thought that doing so might weaken him and might increase the likelihood that Donald Trump would be reelected. And as it turns out, I think we can now see that that was probably a serious mistake, that either we needed Joe Biden to reveal himself earlier in this process to be effective, and maybe he would have been sharper on Thursday night, or else to reveal himself to be diminished and to be as charitable about this as possible. I think Joe Biden has been a highly capable president. I think he might still be an effective president. But having said that, it's not just an administrative job. It's not just a job that involves passing policy and making good decisions and orchestrating diplomacy and coalitions and alliances. It's also a job that involves symbolically unifying and leading the nation. And Joe Biden has always been weak in that leadership capacity, and at this point appears to be so diminished that he's incapable of doing that, and that makes it unlikely that he's going to be reelected, even if he might be a highly effective second term president. So we, the Democrats, didn't contest Joe Biden in the primaries, and I think we're beginning to regret that. I also think that Joe Biden's refusal to bow out, right? He had advisors go forth when he was running in 2020 and say that he would be a bridge to the future, that he would not seek a second term, that he was only running because he thought he was the right person to defeat Donald Trump. And, we should have taken that with a grain of salt, but we also should have tried to hold him to account for that. The power of incumbency, the power in American politics of the person who already holds the office to uh, neutralize any opposition. And in part, this has to do with this incredibly outsized role that money plays in American politics and the incredible advantage that an incumbent has in fundraising. And then I also want to argue that there's an issue perhaps with popular primaries, right? And so this is a relatively new institution. It goes back to the early 1970s. And what we know about presidential primaries is that they are among the least high turnout elections in American politics. Generally speaking, around 20% of the population participates in them. They tend to be more ideologically extreme or partisan voters. Many states have rules that only allow someone who is a registered member of the party to participate in the primary. And the result is that the primary chooses our presidential candidate via a mechanism that is not very representative or inclusive. And again, I think one of the things constructively to be thinking about is how can we get to a point where we're thinking more about the positive attributes of our candidates and their platforms as opposed to what they're opposing. How can we get to a point where perhaps there's less money in our politics and incumbency carries less of an advantage? How could we reform our primary system so that a broader swath of the electorate is involved and the candidates face a test that is more akin to the general election? I have on the board um, two books, both by Daniel Schlossman. The earlier book, When Movements Anchor Parties, I'll talk about in a moment. The more recent book, co-authored with Sam Rosenfeld, called The Hollow Parties, is about the weakness of American parties right now, about the fact that these parties basically just serve as vehicles for candidates chosen in primaries and do not do much in terms of actually selecting those candidates, training or socializing those candidates, disciplining those candidates, or for that matter, organizing the voters in civil society. The parties are conduits for donors to connect to candidates, right? And that's a very weak function for political parties to play. And the result is that we have historically weak candidates for the most important position in American politics, the presidency of the United States. Those two things go hand in hand. And by the way, what Schlossman's earlier book helps us to see is that we are also weak as voters. We and the idea of movements anchoring parties refers in the first instance to the Democratic Party of the New Deal and its relationship to labor unions, and the fact that it wasn't just the party was, on the one hand, funded, but on the other hand, also disciplined by independent civil society, social movements, unions, the trade union movement, and that the result was that the party needed to do the work of convincing the unions that the leaders it was nominating were effective, and the unions in turn did the work of mobilizing voters, fundraising, etc. And so we don't have, right, any capacity for organizing ourselves and making ourselves more effective against the donors, the donor class, and we have become a much more unequal society. And so people who can write 6 and 7 figure checks, and as we've seen, right, part of the reason that Trump had such a fundraising bonanza after his conviction is that one person whose last name happens to be Mellon wrote a $50 million check, right? And that's just something that should not be legal in a democracy for somebody to have that kind of influence. So who matters in American politics in 2024? And that helps us to focus on the question, who might be able to actually implore or compel Joe Biden to reconsider his candidacy. And there is a scenario here in which Joe Biden is a highly effective candidate every day, and I think we're about 140 days from the election, for the next 139 days, right? But I just think, given what we saw on Thursday night, there's no way to predict or rely on the idea that Joe Biden is going to be the man we saw on Friday and not the man we saw on Thursday night. But even if he is, every day he has a fabulous debate performance in the second debate. He's out on the stump and highly effective and more charismatic than he's ever been in his life. The damage done Thursday night is going to be hard to erase. And so if Joe Biden is serious about not allowing Donald Trump to be the next president of the United States, he needs to really weigh whether he is the most effective person to lead his party against Donald Trump. And frankly, what we're seeing is Joe Biden is unwilling to consider that. So, who else might be able to convince him? Donors, media, advisors. The party is not strong enough in and of itself. Let's envision the scenario for a few minutes, right? What would a late game change in leadership look like? And here I want to suggest a few different scenarios. One of them, Biden voluntarily steps aside, right? And when I say voluntarily, it may be that his donors will have to threaten him. And please note, that's a high risk game, because if they threaten him and he still doesn't get out of the way, he's further damaged. Perhaps he doesn't have enough funds to do the work he has to do right now to build the organization to turn out his voters. Or perhaps what happens in the media around the donors threatening him further damages his credibility and distracts him from campaigning effectively. But having said that, let's assume that he is eventually convinced that he needs to get out of the way. Um, and at the same time, he endorses an alternative. And here I'm going to assume that that would probably be the Vice President, Kamala Harris, and that if the party quickly coalesced behind Biden's alternative, if he was able to effectively discipline the delegates to the Democratic nominating convention who are pledged to him to support the person he endorses, we might have a relatively neat process. It would still be an open convention of the kind that we haven't had since 1968, where the delegates who have been bound by law to support Joe Biden are released, and then they get to decide who the Democratic nominee will be. But if there's been agreement and it's been more or less consensually endorsed, then maybe this whole thing is neat and clean. But having said that, I think the alternative among them is that Biden steps aside and doesn't endorse somebody else. He leaves it up to the delegates to decide, is it Gavin Newsom? Is it Kamala Harris? Is it the governor of Michigan, or Pete Buttigieg, or the senator from New Jersey? Right? We can throw out our list of viable candidates, and they have to then spend this incredibly dense, short period trying to convince the donor class, the media class, the electorate, but especially the delegates. It's me, Gavin Newsom. I'm the best, most likely person to be able to defeat Donald Trump. The donors will fall in behind me, etc., and so on. This could be a very messy process. And now let me say one more thing about this, right? By the way, even scenario one could be quite messy, because Joe Biden might say, I want Kamala Harris, and Gavin Newsom might say, too bad, I'm still entering the fray. Is that bad? for the Democrats. And I think that the simple, easy, most direct answer is of course it is. This makes this party look completely anarchical and further damages them, gives them probably plenty of attack lines for the Republicans to use, because the only way that one of these candidates emerges as the clear front runner is by criticizing the others. And so all of them will have been criticized by the time the convention concludes. But having said all of that, please note what a remarkable spectacle this could be, right? And that we live in a moment in which media spectacle seems to capture the attention of otherwise distracted voters. And that's obviously part of the problem. That's what we should be talking about today if we had had a normal week in American politics last week. But we have to recognize that this might be the perfect political theater for the third decade of the 21st century. And so that's, I think, just worth noting. Third and final scenario here is that Biden does not voluntarily step aside, but nevertheless, he faces a challenge from within. I think it's very unlikely that that challenge will succeed, right? As I've said, the delegates, many of them are legally bound to support Joe Biden. Those that aren't are still going to be under tremendous pressure to actually vote for the person they were elected to vote for. It would be, I think, very difficult infight within the party. All right, so I did want to speak with you, and let me do so very briefly about the other big piece of news this week. And I don't want to suggest that there aren't other things that we should be talking about, but the Supreme Court handed down a number of extremely important decisions, some of which I'm going to take much greater time to speak with you about in a future lecture. But there is this decision, actually two decisions, one of them in the Loper case, the other of them in the interestingly titled Relentless case, in which under straight party line vote, the six conservative members of the court voted to overturn the Chevron doctrine, which goes back to a court case from 1984 that essentially said when Congress gives general authority to administrative agencies to promulgate and enforce regulations to do things like protect the clean air or clean water or food supply or the safety of our drugs and cars, the judiciary should defer to the expertise of those agencies as long as what they're doing is a reasonable interpretation of the statute that authorized them to do it. And the Supreme Court overturned that decision, the Chevron decision, yesterday. And in so doing, they have replaced the administrative agency's discretion and judgment with judicial oversight. And so, to be as clear as possible, this aggrandizes the power of the judiciary against Congress, who authorizes these agencies, and against the executive, the president, who appoints the officials to these agencies, and against the civil service in general, who populates the lower levels of these agencies. And the clear upshot of this is that the way in which the administrative state, right, has been grafted onto the 18th century constitutional structure of the United States. We have a constitution that Jill Lepore recently referred to as geriatric, right? I think it's part of the issue with Joe Biden's performance. We don't want our president to be as incapacitated as our Constitution seems to be. Well, we kind of solved this problem by allowing administrative agencies to exercise something akin to legislative, or to be more precise, regulatory authority. And this got codified, solidified, juridified, sorry, by the Supreme Court in 1984. It's just been overturned, and we will have to see. But this is potentially a sweeping transformation of American law and policy. It may make it very difficult for us to combat climate change, to protect the safety of our food supply, of our consumer goods in general, of our drugs and medicine. And to be as clear as possible, this is one of the things that seems to me to be a deep problem with Joe Biden's performance in the debate on Thursday night. I want to bring these themes together for a moment. He needed to make clear that there has been a protracted effort over the last 50 years to wrest control of the federal judiciary in a highly partisan, expensive, sustained, smart, strategic campaign, right? We've talked together about Stephen Tillis's The Rise of the Conservative Legal Movement, and the way in which, right, probably at least $500 million have been spent to remake the federal judiciary. And this is now bearing fruit. And the fact is that the judiciary, and especially the Supreme Court, appears increasingly to be the most functional and stable, as well as the least responsive and accountable of the federal government branches. It's taking more power to itself. It's acting in an increasingly partisan way. It's pursuing an increasingly pro-business, anti-labor, anti-regulatory, anti-egalitarian agenda. And we run the risk, if you go back for a moment, let me go all the way to the beginning, right? At the picture of the Supreme Court, we have the 5 older members sitting, the 4 younger standing in the back row, and it's very likely that the next president of the United States will replace Clarence Thomas or Samuel Alito or John Roberts or Sonia Sotomayor. And when they do, they may further tilt the balance of this court, or further consolidate the longevity of this very conservative supermajority. And that also needs to be emphasized. But Joe Biden appeared to be incapable of getting that across on Thursday night. Let me stop there. I'm sure you have thoughts. I know this is a hard topic. Who wants to start us off with a question or a comment? Please just unmute yourself and let me hear from you. Okay. I can't see. It looks like Genevieve was trying to talk, but Chung, go ahead. I'm glad you were able to join us today. I know you were thinking of going somewhere else, and thank you for the email. Go ahead.
Uh, I think I think your analysis is right on target, but I would say that I think the prospects of having an open convention in which, I mean, Biden nominating somebody, it could only be Kamala Harris, and I think Kamala Harris is a very weak candidate. I don't think it's necessarily her fault. Her interview on CNN after the thing, I thought she looked very good, but she really has no qualifications to be president. I mean, in the eyes of voters. But beyond that, it does seem to me that a convention where, reasonably attractive, younger, than Biden, God knows, people are competing in a genuinely open convention would be a terrific television spectacle. And if they don't do that, all the convention is going to be is genocide versus anti-Semitism. What else do they have to talk about? So, or
Right.
cover, or for the media to push people on. So I think that's it. I think that's the best prospect. And I don't know exactly who I would support, but I could support. Well, of course, I would support anybody they nominated. But I don't think that's at all a bad thing.
And I completely agree with you. And so let me say just another couple things very quickly. Right. One of them is that presumably, if Joe Biden got out of the way, the person who would succeed him would not be a baby boomer, right? And this is something that so many people who are younger are desperate to see, right?
Yep.
This large, powerful generation finally relinquish power in our politics, and our politics have become a gerontocracy, and that's not healthy, right? The second thing is it might make it look like one of our moribund institutions, the Democratic Party, is actually starting to work, actually
Mhm.
starting to do something, right? And that might also be what we need to restore a little bit of faith in the idea that these old institutions might still be able to work for us. So yeah, I completely agree with you, John. And by the way, if it's just nominating Joe Biden, there are going to be a lot of people watching baseball instead of watching the Democratic National Convention.
Well, probably that would be a good thing. But
I haven't been following. Hannah, I see you've got your hand up, and then it looks like Benita does too. But Hannah, I think I
Yeah,
saw your hand first. Go ahead.
I certainly I think we need a messy convention.
Mhm.
In October or November, The Apprentice is going to come out as a knockout movie, and we have to have something with passion in order to at least counter it.
Yeah, yeah.
That's
Thank
it.
you. And yeah, I haven't been thinking or paying very much attention to that movie, but yeah, I mean it does seem like the stars are aligning for a second term of Donald Trump, unless there's something that disrupts the momentum that's building up. Benita, go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Just fine, thank you.
Okay. I know he's not young, but I think we need Al Gore
Oh,
climate.
he's
He,
still alive?
he's only 75. He's a baby, but his
Boomer.
but his defense of the climate is so important that we can't forget that.
Yeah,
That's
and obviously he's a Nobel Prize winner and a vice president and a baby boomer, but a little bit younger. I have no idea what Al Gore has been doing. I know that he did a second volume of An Inconvenient Truth. I know he's been teaching public policy at places. That's a wild card. Interesting suggestion, Benita. I have no idea if he's interested in the job, but you are right that it seems to me that one of the things that really does need to be focal, and that a younger candidate hopefully would be better at framing, is both how urgent the problem of climate change is, and this should be obvious, right? I just got it's too far away. The most recent copy of the New Yorker. Have you seen the cover of the person reading their book while their refrigerator is open and their feet are in the refrigerator? We've had a terrible, beginning to the summer, and so it is on people's minds that things are heating up. And obviously, Donald Trump took us out of the Paris Accords and is as pro petroleum a president as I think we could envision happening in the 21st century. Did anybody else have a comment or a thought for?
Yes, I have a comment.
I
It's
can't help you
Doris.
with that. Go ahead.
Doris,
Hi,
you
Doris.
know, why do we think of Biden leaving the presidency as a loss? Why can't we look at it as a positive thing? In other words, that what he would be doing would be for the country.
Thank you, Doris. And
As
again,
someone had said, he could be a hero.
yeah.
He
And
could make a great
and
speech.
by the way, Doris, been a while since I've seen you. Nice to see you. But having said that, I think when we look at the first 4 years of Biden's presidency, we see among the most effective presidents of the 21st century in terms of his legislative agenda, in terms of stuff that's been done in the administrative state that gets less attention, in terms of really trying to restart a little bit of manufacturing and a green economy in the United States. And all of that will be eclipsed, will be forgotten if he's a one-term president who allows Donald Trump back into the presidency.
But they could use all of that to go ahead for the next candidate.
Yeah, exactly. Bow out gracefully and pass the baton, and do so having proudly been a very good president for 4 years, but recognizing, I was looking at this, the average age of the CEO in the United States is 58. Right? And Joe Biden is 81. And I've defended to you the idea that we should not be ageist, that different people age at different rates, and that I think Joe Biden in his late 70s and early 80s has been a very effective president. But having said that, the performance on Thursday night, even if it's a complete anomaly due to illness and distraction, and he just choked because of the pressure of the moment, and he's not that good a public speaker, whatever the explanation is, it is going to weigh on his candidacy throughout this election in ways that, fair or not, make it much more likely that he's going to lose. Flossie, you had your hand up a couple of minutes ago. You need to unmute. You're still muted, Flossie. There you go, I hope. Nope. Up.
And Biden needs a blood transfusion. He really needs the services of his doctors. It wasn't that he had nothing to say. He didn't have breath enough to say it. Did he have breath enough, it would have made a big difference. I'm sorry to have to say that, but hitting 100, I know what it feels like to get old, and he's getting old. I wish him well. He also needs a good new speechwriter. The Democratic Party needs a new writer. There are so many books out. We need someone to talk about what it means to be a Democrat. Yes. Thank God bless everybody.
There was an op-ed, and I can't remember. It might actually have been Ronald Reagan's daughter who wrote it. Was saying what Joe Biden really needs is somebody akin to Nancy Reagan, who in his 1984 campaign said, no, you need to get enough sleep, right? You need to slow down. You need to have your energy for the moments that matter. And here I want to say, among Joe Biden's virtues may be the conscientiousness with which he's handled the details of policy throughout his political career. And that involves an intense investment of energy when the issues are as complex and daunting as the issues facing the United States today. He is understandably diminished by this office, and it might be all he needs is a good vacation. Whatever it is he needs, a new speechwriter, better coaching for the debate, better medicine for the cold, a good night's sleep. He didn't get it. And now we have to deal with the aftermath. It happened, right? David, go ahead. Yeah, I think you have to unmute.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you pushed the conversation in this direction, because I'm not very sanguine about an alternative candidate. As much as that would be my first choice, I just I don't see one in the wings. I agree with John that Kamala carries baggage that would make her unpopular. But So I think what we have to do is to ask ourselves what can be done to change the optics for Biden, and I believe that he needs a different kind of preparation. You talked about being more thoughtful and slower. He'd have been a lot better off if instead of trying to get out all those sound bites that he was filled with by his advisors, he listened to what Trump said, and then he just got one or two points or facts in rebuttal of those things that would have been so much more effective in the way that we've been talking about it here today. And so I just think he needs a different kind of preparation, and we need to take advantage of the things that he does stand for, and that is he gets things done. He brings people together. I don't know what the narrative is, but never before. I've said several times that the Democrats don't have a good narrative, and now we need a Joe Biden narrative that convinces people otherwise. The only pundit I saw who was in his corner and thought he did okay was Heather Cox Richardson. Everybody else I read said it's time to go, Joe. Yeah.
And I read that Heather Cox Richardson. I'm sorry, I just need to meet you because we're getting an echo. The Heather Cox Richardson newsletter, and I find her very insightful and impressive on 19th century American history. When it comes to 21st century, I think she very often looks at everything through such a partisan lens, right? I started today's lecture with right, Max Weber's idea that a person with a vocation for politics lets reality work on them, right? There's just very little way to believe that anybody who was not already firmly in Joe Biden's corner Thursday night came away from that debate more convinced that he could be president. And yes, I go back to 1984, right, when Ronald Reagan was thought of as diminished, and we now know, right, that he probably had early stages of Alzheimer's already, but he diffuse the attack with humor and charm and calm, right? And we can't go back. We can't whisper in Joe Biden's ear and get him to do it effectively. But yes, he was poorly prepared for this debate if he thought that the right way to show that he was still up to the job was by being the ultimate policy wonk, and he failed that test abysmally. But it can't be undone. Does that mean that he's going to drop out of the race? Does it mean that somebody better will come along? There's absolutely no guarantee on either of those fronts, but it does mean he enters the fall, the home stretch of the presidential campaign, more damaged than he was before Thursday night. All right, everyone.
Yeah, my analysis is that what we had was the distinction between an overwhelmed patriot and an absolutely unhinged charlatan.
Fair enough. And I don't, and look, I mean, I think one of the real shames of call it Thursday Night Joe, right? Or of the fact that the Democrats nominated somebody for this office who can't do the job of exposing Donald Trump to be the unhinged charlatan that he is, right? Is that Donald Trump basically got away with it. It's obvious to anybody who doesn't like him. I'm just not clear that it's obvious to anyone else. All right, everyone. Somber topic for today. To be continued. I take some solace in being able to have these conversations with you guys. Thank you for the ongoing opportunity to do so. Be well, chin up. We may have a lot of work to do over the next few years. Take care, everybody. Thank you, and see you next week. Bye, guys.
Thank you, David.
My pleasure as always. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.